Hello, everybody. Thank you for being here. My name is Romina Cordova, and I'm also a second-year urban design student. The topic for this second session is RICA as Urban Design Agency for Development. So today we will be hearing from Sierra Bainbridge. She's co-founder and senior principal at Mass, where she directs the Landscape Studio and Abundant Futures Lab. She has a background in landscape architecture, ecology, and regional planning. Her work has been recognized for design excellence, research and analysis, and sustainability by the ASLA, AIA, COTE, and the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum Award. Okay. So, as we think about urban design, not only as architecture or landscape, but as a strategic agency of development, it is helpful to locate our discussion in the context of Kigali and Rwanda, a place of remarkable transition, ambition, and challenge. With Rwanda's population expected to double by 2050, and more than half of its people projected to live in cities by 2035, the country stands at a pivotal threshold. Urbanization, once concentrated in Kigali, now extends across hills and valleys, reshaping the relationship between rural and urban life. Kigali itself is constantly negotiating the tensions between density and landscape, aspiration and ecology. So in this moment, urban design becomes a development agency, shaping infrastructure, ecology, housing, mobility and social life, and even food systems. So projects like RICA emphasize this expanded role, not merely inserting buildings or landscapes, but orchestrating ecological flows, local economies, and rural-urban linkages. So urban design then can drive not only city making, but nation building. And with that framing, let's welcome Sierra and dive into a conversation about how RICA is not only a campus, but a lever of urban and regional transformation.
Hello, everyone. Good to see you all again today, or maybe for the first time. And I'm excited to dig into some of the topics that were brought up in the last session. Alan's not allowed to talk about landscape, but I get to do it forever. But today I want to talk a little bit and dig into what does a process look like when it is landscape-led. And by that, I mean regional and infrastructural systems, as well as experiential and sensorial moments. The idea of accompaniment, something that you may not see explicit in the exhibits outside, is a way of working that we learned from Dr. Paul Farmer and Partners in Health on our first project, the Butaro Hospital in northern Rwanda. As he describes it, accompaniment is most often about walking alongside the patient or sticking with a task until it's deemed completed by the person or person being accompanied, rather than by the accompanateur. The idea of accompaniment, of proximity, listening, shared responsibility has shaped everything we've done since. Lately, I've been thinking a lot about what does it mean to expand that thinking, to ask not only how we accompany communities, which we've been practicing for some time now, but how do we accompany nature? How do we recognize the extent to which we've marginalized the natural world and begin to repair that relationship? What would it mean as designers and citizens to accompany nature, to walk beside, to support, and rather than exploit the landscapes and ecologies that we've altered? One Health is an idea that spurred a lot of the thinking for this project. It initially came from the medical and veterinary disciplines, and really understanding the moments of zoonotic disease transmission, recognizing that human, animal, and ecological health are inseparable. Through this lens, every project becomes an opportunity to reweave these relationships, to treat the health of ecosystems as fundamental to the health of people and economies. As Alan went into a little bit, the planetary boundaries, actually a lot, so I don't have to do it too much, I'm so happy. But planetary boundaries is this theoretical framework that defines the place where human needs and planetary flourishing can be balanced. RICA was our attempt to see what it looks like to try to build inside those boundaries, to see the constraint as a framework for creativity. From the landscape perspective, how can one piece of land support twice as many people without exhausting its capacity to sustain life? So, before we started building, programming, siting, planning, we got to know the site intimately. Like accompanying a patient, how do we sit, listen, and understand the strengths and ailments of a place? People went out on boats, they tested water. We did soil tests all over the site to understand fertility. We looked at where people are moving, how this relates to the community, what is there. We did ecological studies, as mentioned, counts of what exists in which parts of the site. And through this, we started to understand how to interact with this site to highest and best use. The Savannah woodland, which we mentioned a lot, was a big guide for some reason. There we go. But as well, the papyrus wetlands. And then also understanding the areas that had already had some degradation and therefore perhaps were best suited for future development. We began to understand where and how to operate for highest and best use. What does it mean to see ecology as infrastructure as well as instructor for agricultural students? That ecosystem became our first client. Design began with what should remain untouched. We protected the high biodiversity zones, reconnected woodlands and wetlands through stormwater corridors that double as ecological corridors. We built where the land was already disturbed. Within this frame, we next looked to agriculture to organize form. Agriculture structures the campus itself. You see all these big circles. I don't know if anyone's asked why are there so many big circles, but part of the conservation of soils and water come from the use of pivot irrigation systems. And so part of the utility of those pivots, and they are growing and expanding across the campus outside of the area that we worked, creates part of the language of that landscape within which we worked. We learned every day, agriculture structures the campus itself and students live within these working landscapes. These are the first year students, and so the first year experience was really about understanding what does the typical farmer's share of land look like. It's about 2.1 hectares that each farmer farms in Rwanda. And what are the balances of livestock versus vegetation? How do you create an income? How do you track what it looks like to increase fertility in your soils rather than lose fertility? And so all those decision points that a farmer has to make day to day were part of that first year experience. The areas to the right were where we had the enterprises, which were food and veg, dairy and ruminants, swine and poultry, mech and irrigation. And those were all about understanding the circular systems for agricultural enterprises. How do we understand how to have waste composted into fertilizer, how to harvest rainwater and reuse it, how to embed infrastructure within ecological cycles, how to have solar energy and other alternative energies power our work. Nothing is hidden, everything is visible and teachable. In these areas, the students spend their second and third years understanding enterprise at the larger scale. What might it look like to scale up from those 2-hectare farms and to create entrepreneurial opportunities for agriculture in the future of Rwanda? What bound those agricultural lands and those living residential areas together was what we called the central spine. This is the place where research plots, arboretum collections, native plant collections, and all of those ecological systems find themselves along the walk that every student takes to class, to the student center, and to the place where they're working each day. And so all of these things are exposed to them constantly, and they're also changing constantly depending on the research being done. We also wanted to have biodiversity proliferate. We propagated, as mentioned many times, over 1 million plants that were based in the over 120 species that we collected on site. And this allowed a living nursery within the site that is still active, and began the processes of restoration, which started with few plants and plant communities, but understanding how those take off. But I think most importantly, in a place where most of the ecological landscapes have been wiped out, our agriculture is sustained by those ecological systems. And so we need to have those growing and acting as students are learning every day. Through the nursery cropping, we then began to distribute these all along the spine, and this is just a brief look into what that looked like. Everyday life at RICA is an education in the systems thinking and seeing how these things begin to distribute and grow throughout the years. The students measure biodiversity, water quality, soil health, and energy use. The landscape is their teacher. We measured biodiversity ourselves by a number of metrics, and those continue to be observed today. And we also looked at, as we've mentioned before, embodied carbon. While we, complementing understanding of reducing carbon spend, the local material use halved our embodied carbon, and the restored landscapes now sequester what remains, and we're hoping will be carbon positive in 2 decades. I think the thing that's really exciting to me is, though, and hopefully part of, what spurs people on as we leave today is, how do we begin to apply that globally? This is something that worked, and helped us learn about possible systems, possible ways of working in this one place. But for us, I think, and hopefully, we're assuming the reason that this has been selected is that so many of the learnings that we had here, we hope are applicable. One of the places that we think about this, or that I think about this, is in what we call fringe cities, which are smaller post-industrial centers in the United States that hold possible ecological opportunity. By mapping energy flows, material flows, we can begin to choreograph regeneration at regional scale. And so one of the thinkings is that some of these cities, particularly those we're looking at in the Northeast and all of these places where there is, foreseen to be great climate migration, how can we begin to look at those cities, which our infrastructure in the past has decimated, utilizing that infrastructure to be the place of recreation of economic opportunity in those places? And how do we look really deeply? How do we look across the things that built those cities, timber, iron, water in the case of Poughkeepsie, and many throughout the Northeast and the East and in post-industrial areas, and also thinking about how those things transform and translate into future economies. These are some of the cities that we're thinking about in the Northeast. But I think the idea of thinking about cities within planetary boundaries, how do we think about where our food comes from, where our building materials come from? Can we begin to localize that in the way that we understand localization of food? That, to me, is another learning that we think really needs to be brought into all of our design conversations today. Another way, and this is a smaller way, I think we're always looking for different kinds of tweaks in different places, is procurement. And that is, again, the basis of how we manage to have RICA be so impactful across the multiple entities that we interface with, whether they were cooperatives or plant growers or farmers. But when we worked on Franklin Park Master Plan, one of the things that I just latched onto and wasn't part of the scope, but how do we convince Boston to procure in such a way that they're actually supporting the neighborhoods in which they're working, and that we're really building in identity into place? And so thinking about, what does it look like to have procurement for people and planet? How do we invest in knowledge sharing and training, commissioning local talent, contracting with businesses and marginalized communities, specifying regionally and ethically sourced materials? Understanding that there's still great disparity, and in this particular case, there is huge disparity along the boundaries of this park, and people who feel that they don't have ownership of the space that's only 2 blocks from their home. By building in that place, by putting your art in that place, you begin to have a much different relationship to that place. Our U.S. workforce also continues to be extremely focused on certain communities. There are only 3% of our workforce in construction that are women, and that is down from the 1970s. How do we use how we procure to bring more and more people into this system and have their vision realized? And that all these things actually are part and parcel of how we think about equity, extraction, climate. Those, as we've learned from RICA, when we're thinking about all these things together, we are solving for some of these bigger questions. So, excited to talk more about this. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sierra, for your presentation. For the panel and discussion, we will be joined by Professor Jungyoon Kim, Associate Professor in Practice of Landscape Architecture here at the GSD, and the practicing landscape architect registered in both the Netherlands and Massachusetts. She co-founded the design firm Parkem in Rotterdam, later relocating to Seoul in Korea. And since then, Parkin has completed projects of diverse scales and typologies, ranging from corporate landscapes to civic venues. And we'll also be joined by Professor Stephen Gray, an associate professor of urban design and director of the urban design project here at the GSD. He's an urban designer, educator, and principal of Grayscale Collaborative, a research and design firm focused on spatial justice and equitable development. Stephen's research, teaching, and practice examine how race, capital, and infrastructure intersect to shape cities. So thank you very much for being here. So thank you, Sierra, for your presentation. Actually, a lot of my questions were going to be about how to transfer the learnings from RICA to other urban centers. So I really appreciated examples from other cities and how you applied what you learned from RICA. So to start, I'd like to invite you to reflect on what does it mean for urban design to drive development rather than just respond to it in the Rwanda context, but also beyond. For the three of you.
Yeah. I think Alan and I were talking, it's hard to have said all the things and then not say them all over again. Because I do think that, as I'm, learning how to translate some of these approaches into other places, and so much, and maybe I'll refer to, a project that we're working on at the studio level yet. It's not a project yet, but working in Dakar, where we have similar, just rapid expansion of residential land, development, informal, across the landscape, such that ecological systems are being compromised completely. And then therefore, when you're living in those places, you are subject to flooding, you are subject to urban heat, and all of the things that make it challenging and will continue to worsen as climate effects kick in. And it is because that we've not followed the landscape's needs, right? And so I think that is the first line of understanding, and I think it applies whether you're looking retroactively at a place that has, pushed the systems below ground, or whether you're starting afresh, which we were able to do more or less in the RICA example. But I think starting with that regional scale systems understanding and then allowing that to lead how we think about where we do what we want to do from an urban design perspective.
So for me, I think it's really about the agency that you bring to the people that are going to be the recipients of the places and the stewards of the places that you're designing and imagining. Something that struck me about how Christian sort of described this in his session, he said you start by coming not to talk about what you're going to be doing, but to talk about what people are already doing, and really reframing the problem and the question through their eyes, so that they actually see the value of the work and they also see their own value in participating in the work. And so I think, agency, extending that agency, moving beyond, the typical things that we define as urban design or design, which are looking at, buildings and blocks and districts, or, the things that interconnect things, transit systems, open space systems, but actually engaging, analyzing, assessing, engaging, and then transforming slowly agencies of power and bringing more people into that process. So to me, that's really evident, and that is the way that that I think is the future of how to develop sustainably and effectively.
I really agree what you just mentioned, Stephen. So I was really privileged to visit RICA last January as a member of the jury this year. So, before I made my trip, because it was my first time to Africa and Rwanda, of course, I did my research and I Googled and I Google Earth and everything. But then what I didn't find before I go to a trip is that the similarity of the geomorphology between Rwanda and Korea. So Korea is my hometown. So both countries are really like hilly countries. So urbanization was really filling in those valleys first, and then just encroaching the surrounding area. But then urbanization in Korea happened like between 60s and 80s. At that time, we didn't have really ecological framework. We didn't really value ecology, of course, as a kind of framework of urbanization. I mean, we didn't really talk about climate change at the time. But then Rwanda, as a latecomer, I think we just have total opportunity of using this ecology as a framework. And I think that's why RICA could be urbanization strategy. So as Christian mentioned in the morning, he said, of course, you kind of transform this constraint into chance, which not everyone can actually do. But then you kind of were able to advance all this experiment, and then you learn it from the local knowledge, and then you really test it out if the ecological strategy was really working in terms of forming the campus. So I think in Rwanda, in terms of the future urbanization, that is really happening already along the highway. There are like new towns are kind of filling in those valley area. I was traveling from Kigali to Mount volcanoes, and I was really able to see those like a new little cities already like happening along the highway. So I think again, RICA's ecological framework really should be applied to those future little cities urbanization in Rwanda. And also, just briefly, when I was in RICA, I was guided by Anton, the principal of Kigali office. He said he was kind of busy welcoming a delegate from Algeria. So it seems like many politicians and government workers are actually visiting RICA to learn from RICA in order to make their own campus of agriculture, conservation agriculture, education. So obviously they are learning from RICA, and I think it will impact how urbanization will happen in other countries in Africa. So in that way also, I think it is really urban strategy, even though it's in the rural area.
Well, and just to add one thing to what you said, which is, the sort of process that MASS brings to this project and all of their work really is learning from, and sort of accompaniment was how you described it, learning from local activity, but positioning those people to then flourish in that activity in different ways, right? And so you're actually planting seeds, or I guess fertilizing or sort of adding some extra care to the seeds that are already there to get people positioned to actually sustainably build their own country and continue the work well after you're gone in new and innovative ways. And like that is, that's actually helping people develop their own country, which is a different perspective and a different way to think about it. Very bottom up, but not in like the cliche bottom up. You're actually doing the work.
Yeah, thank you. Because of course, regarding the rapid urbanization of previously rural places, RICA can be a model to follow. But I was wondering how do you think, in which aspects do you think make it transferable or not to a model for urban Kigali? Like, which lessons have you learned to transfer it to actually a very dense city?
I mean, I think the starting place is similar, and I actually will respond to that, but I also am interested a little bit in the kind of combination of both of your comments. I'm going to do like a big round circle, but I think this idea of like localization of agency in the people who are living there and learning from, you know, what is the knowledge base that actually produces the project, which we learned, I think, first in Alima, actually. Not first, I mean, and we learned it all along the way. I mean, I think part of it started in Butaro, but, you know, how do we understand how people are working? What are the materials they're using? How does that actually drive the project versus, you know, some other direction? But also in combination with this idea about how ecology is actually quite present in Rwanda. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the things that's really interesting to me about how Rwanda is developed through, and is developing now, through challenging times, you know, that there has been a lot of informal settlement that have been removed, you know, without the, you know, the proper setups for those communities to be relocated and flourishing. And right now we have the increased relationship and pressures between animal or like wildlife and human because of that like densification that's happening throughout Rwanda. And actually the government is, and I think is doing a really amazing job at demonstrating globally a community-based, community-centered way of looking at conservation in terms of how they're expanding the national parks, which is unusual because most of the time conservation is looked at continually still today as a colonial effort, right? That it's entities from outside of these places, whether it's in Africa or others, kind of projecting what they think should be saved and how, and really losing the communities which have to be part of that process because they know how to take care of the land. Like they've been doing it for a very long time, and it's actually just population growth that has compromised that, and increase of infrastructure without planning and without the kind of larger scale thinking and without understanding the systems that have been at play for centuries. And so I think those two things come together, and it's really, really interesting to see how that's playing out in Rwanda as a kind of community-based system. I think in terms of how it applies in Kigali, you know, most of our projects are outside, but I think we have done a few projects in the city, and I think continually look for opportunities to find the craftspeople who begin to create the future identity of the place, and find ways for that to come through in projects, whether it's in the landscape or in the architecture. And when it's in the city, it's a bigger opportunity. Like each project that we do is a potential pilot or like a test or a communication of what is possible. And so Norquin is a project that we built in the middle of the city, which is amazing because it also continues all of the things that we started here, but with an urban refinement that to me is like so exciting because it was our first urban project and was able to be built with a very different perspective, but still is using these local materials, using local craft, and having it be something that's completely unique to Rwanda. Like you would not see that built anywhere else. And I think in addition, expanding how we use materials that are local, even in urban conditions. And so the work on Adobe Block being something that you can build with, you know, once you learn how to build safely is super important, especially for cities in Rwanda, but also elsewhere in Africa that are expanding rapidly. And if they're in proximity to a concrete plant, all of that's going to be concrete. So if we can make most of that earth, we're going to be much better off from an embodied carbon perspective.
I just want to add one thing. I just brought this copy of the visit report that Gongji and you and I put together after the respective visit, because Gongji and I, out of 4 jury members, are the ones who visited RICA. We actually particularly mentioned about your practice as well, not just about RICA, but the practice of MES, your social impact to the country and also Kigali, because the prize really articulates the winner should not be just one single architecture project or one open space project. It should have social impact and really significant influence on urbanization of that place. You're the inaugurating chair. You were the inaugurating chair of the first architecture department of University of Rwanda, right? Mm-hmm. So before that, there was no. I think that university is still the only accredited architecture major in the country, right? And then there's still no landscape department in Rwanda. So I think what you're actually doing, setting up the pedagogy of the first architecture program and also education, and really hiring them as your designers, and then really carry the pedagogy through your practice. I think that's a kind of more profound replicability of your practice in RICA, rather than just single reuse of the same material. So that I just wanted to mention that.
No, I mean, I think that's exactly right. I think that is part of the ethos of Mass, is thinking systematically, right? Like, even in this project, you had to create a curriculum in order to create an institutional setting that would allow for the kind of big ideas and the big visions that you were trying to achieve. And that required engaging with, the public sector all the way up to the Ministry of Agriculture, as you had done with the Ministry of Health in the past and the Ministry of Education in the past. So you're really engaging power, and you're engaging local knowledge. I love the story about the stonemasons on the first Butaro project, who got so good at one point that they wanted to just take all of it apart and start over because they just wanted to do it well. And that it even gave that kind of level of craft and beauty to a much broader cross-section of society, because while it was more expensive to use concrete between the stones, and that was a showing of wealth, it was actually more beautiful and cheaper to do it in the way that you had worked with people to do. And so you're creating curriculum, you're creating institutional change, you're cultivating and elevating local craft, and you're doing all of this incrementally. That is the thing that I think is really important for people to take out of all of your work, is that you don't have to come in and blow up the system and start all fresh. You come in, you accompany the purveyors of the system and the people who are a part of it in different sectors and in different walks of life, and then you do something different. And if you look at your practice from start till now, there is a through line of setting a new baseline, and that's the new baseline. This is where we start next time. And then setting another baseline, and this is a new baseline. And this is really a culmination of so many baselines, like the architecture school. Now you have this curriculum and so on and so forth. So I think those are important to take away, that we can all be doing this work. This is not extraordinary work that they're doing. It's just very focused and and cumulative. And we see the extraordinary results of the accumulation of your efforts. But we can all be doing this work slowly and transformatively ourselves as well.
Thank you very much. We don't have time for questions from the audience right now, but we're going to go on to the next session. So thank you. Thank you. Yeah.